We all believe that when the police arrive, the danger is over. But tonight's stories prove that is not always true. A teenager tried to warn her parents about someone outside her window, but nobody listened. A man living in complete isolation called for help, but officers were an hour away. And in one case, the police showed up but at the wrong house. You want to know what happened next? Let's start now. I used to think that calling the police meant you were safe. I thought once they showed up, the danger ended. That belief shattered the night they came to the wrong house. This happened in 2019 when I was living in a small duplex in central Indiana. The neighborhood was quiet and mostly families. My place was attached to another unit that belonged to an older man who kept to himself. I worked second shift at a printing company, so most nights I would get home a little after midnight. On the night this happened, it was early September, a Friday. I remember because I was in a good mood coming home from work, knowing I had the weekend off. I walked inside, microwaved leftovers, and sat down on the couch. Nothing felt unusual at first. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard what I thought was movement outside my window. It was subtle, just the crunch of grass. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it could have been a raccoon or even just the wind. But 5 minutes later, I heard it again, closer, like someone was walking slowly across my yard. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still. The sound stopped. I felt stupid for being paranoid. I got up to lock the door, just in case, even though I already knew it was locked. That was when I noticed something that froze me in place. On the curtain over my front window, there was the faintest shadow. Someone was standing outside on the porch. I went cold all over. I did not move for what felt like forever. Then, trying not to make a sound, I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher that someone was outside my house. She told me to stay quiet, stay hidden, and that officers were already on the way. I crouched in the hallway, holding my phone so tightly my knuckles hurt. Through the silence of the house, I heard the faint creak of the porch boards. Whoever was there had not left. 10 minutes went by before I finally saw flashing blue and red lights reflecting on the walls. Relief washed over me. I could hear car doors slam and muffled voices of officers calling out. I was ready to run outside and meet them when I realized something strange. The voices were not coming from my yard. They were coming from next door. My neighbor's porch light flicked on. I heard the officers banging on his door, shouting for him to come out. My heart sank. They were at the wrong house. I called 911 again, and panicked, and told them the police had gone next door by mistake, that I was the one who had called. The dispatcher said she would notify them immediately. I peeked through the blinds just enough to see what was happening. The two officers were on my neighbor's porch, shining flashlights inside. My neighbor cracked the door open, looking completely confused, and that was when I felt it. A shift in the air behind me. I spun around and nearly dropped my phone. The back door, which I had locked earlier, was wide open. I cannot explain the terror that went through me. My first thought was to scream for the officers, but my voice caught in my throat. My second thought was to bolt for the door, but if someone was inside, they would hear me. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. The living room was dark, the hallway darker, but from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard a sound that made me want to crawl out of my own skin. Slow, careful breathing. I forced myself not to panic. I whispered again into the phone that someone was inside, that the intruder had gotten in. The dispatcher said the officers were moving to my unit. Those next 30 seconds were the longest of my life. I crouched low by the hallway closet, staring toward the kitchen, waiting for movement. My pulse was pounding in my ears. Then I saw it. A figure slowly leaned around the corner from the kitchen, silhouetted by the faint glow of the microwave clock. He saw me. I bolted for the front door. The figure rushed after me. I threw the lock and ripped the door open just as the officers were stepping off my neighbor's porch. I screamed at them that the man was inside. The intruder must have realized the police were right there because he vanished back into the darkness of the house before they could see him. The officers ran in with flashlights drawn. They searched every room, every closet, even the attic. But the man was gone. No broken windows, no sign of forced entry. The only evidence was the back door standing wide open, which I swear I had locked. One officer told me it was possible I had forgotten to lock it. The other suggested maybe the man slipped out the door while I ran for help. Both tried to reassure me that he was gone, but neither of those explanations gave me any comfort. I spent the night at a friend's place. The next morning, when I returned home, I noticed something chilling. On the inside of the back door, written in the dust near the doorknob, was a smudge that looked like a fingertip, as if someone had been gently touching it from the inside, waiting for the right moment to turn it. The police never caught anyone. My neighbor told me later he had been terrified when the officers knocked on his door, but also confused since he had not called them. He kept apologizing like it was his fault, even though it was clearly just a mix-up. I moved out 2 months later. I could not stand being in that house anymore. But the thing that still eats at me to this day is how close I was to being a headline. I did everything right. I called for help. I stayed quiet. I waited. And still, because of a simple mistake, the danger made it inside before anyone could stop it. That night taught me something I wish was not true. Sometimes, the people you depend on to protect you are just human. They can make mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes can be the difference between safety and disappearing without a trace. I live in a rural area of northern Montana. When I say rural, I mean you could drive for 20 minutes and not pass another house. It is the kind of place where you know your nearest neighbors by name because there are only a handful within miles. I grew up in cities, so when I bought this property in 2021, I thought the isolation would be peaceful. I had no idea how terrifying that distance could feel when you needed help. It was late October, right before the first real snow of the year. The nights were already freezing, and by the time the sun went down, it was pitch black outside. My house sat off a long dirt road that stretched 2 miles to the nearest paved highway. I was used to the quiet, but that night it felt oppressive. Around 11 p.m., I was sitting in the living room with a book when I heard a strange sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving something across the porch, but then I heard it again. A deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze, listening hard. I told myself it might be an animal. Bears, deer, and even moose passed through sometimes. But the longer I listened, the less it sounded like that. The steps were slow, spaced apart, almost careful, like someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. My eyes adjusted enough to see the faint outline of the front window. That was when I realized something that made my stomach drop. The crunching sound had stopped directly in front of the house. I grabbed my phone and crept into the hallway. My first instinct was to call a neighbor, but the closest one lived a mile away. It was pointless. So I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher exactly where I lived, spelling out the rural route number and landmarks. She told me officers were on their way, but reminded me it could take close to an hour because of how far out I was. I tried to stay calm, but the silence outside made it unbearable. Every creak of the house settling felt like footsteps inside. I moved into the kitchen to check the back door and nearly screamed when I saw the knob twitch ever so slightly. Someone was testing it. I ducked down behind the counter, holding my phone tight. I whispered again to the dispatcher, who told me to stay hidden and stay quiet. She promised the police were coming, but that promise meant little when I was alone in the dark with someone trying to get in. Minutes dragged on. The back door never opened, but I heard faint scraping, like something being dragged across the siding. Then came the unmistakable sound of a window rattling in its frame. I wanted to run, to bolt out the front and drive away, but my truck keys were hanging by the back door too far out of reach. So I stayed curled behind the counter, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. Instead, everything went quiet again. Dead quiet. I told myself, maybe the person had given up. Maybe they realized I had called for help. But then, from the second floor above me, I heard the faintest floorboard creak. My blood turned to ice. There was no way. I had been downstairs the whole time. I had heard no door open, no window smash. Yet someone was upstairs. I whispered into the phone that whoever it was had gotten inside. The dispatcher's tone shifted. She told me to stay where I was, that officers were pushing as fast as they could. I remember thinking that fast meant nothing when fast was still an hour away. I sat there in total darkness, my body trembling, listening to slow footsteps moving across the floor above. Whoever it was seemed to be pacing, like they were waiting for something. Every once in a while, the floor would groan, and I would clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. At one point, I heard my bedroom door upstairs open and then close again. The image of a stranger walking through my private space made me want to vomit. After what felt like forever, I finally saw headlights bouncing along the dirt road through the front window. Relief flooded me. The police were here. But I made a mistake. In my desperation, I jumped up and ran to the front door, throwing it open to flag them down. Their flashlights swung to me immediately, but in that moment of noise and light, I heard a thundering rush of footsteps from upstairs. By the time the officers entered with guns drawn, whoever had been up there had already slipped out through the back. They searched every corner of the house, every closet, under every bed. Nothing. The back door was still locked, the windows still intact. It made no sense. One officer told me it was possible I had imagined the footsteps out of fear. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been inside. What unsettled me most was what they found on the ground outside. In the dirt by the back of the house, there were tracks. Not boots, not sneakers, bare feet. Large, bare footprints leading around the side of the house and then disappearing into the woods. The officers told me they would increase patrols in the area, but realistically, that meant little. Out there, the woods stretched for miles. Whoever had been at my house could easily vanish without a trace. I did not sleep in that house for weeks. I stayed with my neighbor until I finally installed cameras and reinforced locks. But none of it erased the memory of hearing those footsteps directly above me while I hid, knowing the closest help was still an hour away. The worst part is that the police never found anyone. They never even found signs of forced entry. To this day, I have no idea how the intruder got in or how they left without leaving a trace inside. But sometimes, on winter nights, when the wind is still and the woods are silent, I swear I can hear footsteps again. Slow, careful, deliberate. And every time I do, I wonder if that night was not a one-time event, but just the beginning of something that never really ended. When I was 16, I lived with my parents in a small town in upstate New York. Our house was nothing special, just a two-story place at the end of a quiet street. Most nights in that neighborhood were boring, with nothing happening besides the occasional dog barking or kids riding bikes past sunset. But one night in 2017 changed the way I looked at my own home forever. It was a Saturday night in late November. I was in my room on the second floor, playing games on my laptop. Around 11:00 p.m. I heard a faint noise outside my window. It sounded like a light tap, like someone flicking their finger against the glass. I paused the game and froze. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch. I leaned closer to listen. A few seconds later, it came again, 3 soft taps, evenly spaced. My stomach dropped. There were no trees close enough to hit my window. I tried to calm myself by thinking it might be an animal, but deep down, it felt different. It felt intentional. I went downstairs to tell my parents. My dad was in the living room watching TV and my mom was in the kitchen. I explained what I heard, but they brushed it off right away. My mom said it was probably just the house settling in the cold. My dad joked that maybe a squirrel was trying to get in. I insisted it sounded like tapping, like knuckles on glass. They exchanged a look, then told me I was probably just tired and letting my imagination get the better of me. When I pushed harder, my dad sighed and called the non-emergency police line. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. They walked around the yard with flashlights while I stood at the door. After 5 minutes, they came back and said they did not see anything suspicious. They told my parents everything looked fine and suggested I might be paranoid. Hearing that made me feel embarrassed, like maybe I had overreacted. But as I went back upstairs to my room, I still could not shake the unease. I sat at my desk, staring at the dark window across from me. For almost half an hour, nothing happened. Then, just when I started to relax, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, and I was sure of what I heard. I jumped to my feet, but before I could move closer, I noticed something that made my heart stop. In the faint reflection of the streetlight outside, I could see the outline of a head just beyond the glass. I backed away instantly, too scared to scream. I ran down the hall and into my parents' room, shaking. I told them the person was back, right outside my window. My mom tried to calm me down, saying the police had just been here and found nothing. My dad looked annoyed and told me to get some sleep. I wanted to argue, but I felt defeated. Nobody believed me. That night, I slept on the floor in my parents' room. I remember lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound from downstairs. It was faint but clear, the squeak of the back door hinges. I sat up instantly, my body cold with fear. My dad mumbled that it was probably nothing, but I could hear footsteps moving across the kitchen floor. Slow and deliberate. He finally got up, grabbing a bat he kept in the corner. He crept to the top of the stairs, listening. I stayed frozen beside my mom. Then the sound stopped. The house fell completely silent again. We waited, holding our breath. My dad eventually went downstairs, flipping on the lights. The kitchen was empty, the back door still locked. He told us to go back to sleep, even though I could tell he was uneasy now too. The next morning, everything seemed normal until my mom noticed something near the back door. On the tile floor, just inside, were faint, muddy footprints. Bare footprints. They trailed a few steps into the kitchen and then stopped, as if whoever had left them had stood there watching in silence before vanishing. We all stared at them in disbelief. My dad checked the locks again, but none of them were broken. There were no windows open, no sign of forced entry. It was like the footprints had appeared out of nowhere. When we called the police again, they came to look but offered no explanation. One officer suggested maybe the mud had been tracked in earlier and we only noticed it that morning. Another said maybe it was a prank, but both admitted it was strange. For me, it was not just strange, it was horrifying. Someone had been in our house that night, standing in the kitchen while we were upstairs. And the worst part was that I had tried to warn everyone hours before. If the police had taken it seriously, maybe whoever it was would have been caught. For weeks afterward, I could not sleep in my own room. I kept hearing phantom taps on the glass, even if nothing was there. My parents started taking me more seriously after the footprints, but even they could not explain how someone had gotten in without leaving a trace. Eventually, things went quiet again. No more tapping, no more footprints. But the fear never really went away. Every night before bed, I double-checked the locks, then checked them again. I keep my phone beside me at all times. The thought that still keeps me awake is this: the person who left those muddy prints knew exactly where my room was. They tapped on my window not once, but multiple times, just to see if I would react. And when I did, they found another way inside. The police never solved it. They told us to call if anything else happened, but nothing ever did. Sometimes I wonder if whoever it was simply moved on to another house, another window, another kid whose warnings would be dismissed as paranoia. That night taught me something I hate to admit. Sometimes the fear you feel is not in your head. Sometimes it is real. And sometimes the people you rely on to protect you will not believe you until it is already too late.